Hello class, this is Dr. Branch. I'm going to continue the lecture about marriage, and we are going to discuss two different aspects of marriage now. We are going to discuss sex in marriage, and then we are going to discuss the roles of husband and wife in marriage from Ephesians 5. So, a great deal has been written and said about sex in marriage. It is not Dr. Branch's goal to be a sex therapist, but I am merely going to touch on some of the issues related to God's purposes for sex in marriage between one man and one woman. So with that in mind, let's talk about some of the issues related to sex in marriage. And I want to use an example and give a comparison and contrast between what's called street racing and drag racing at an approved racetrack. So street racing that you see right here looks like maybe a 71 Camaro and some 280Z perhaps over here, probably turbocharged, and they're out on the highway. And the danger of street racing on the highway is you might harm yourself or someone else, other innocent motorists coming down the road when you're going 120 miles an hour in a drag race. So that's street racing. It's dangerous to yourself and to other people. But in contrast, this is real racing at Heartland Park, Topeka. This is a drag strip over about 70 miles, I guess, from our seminary here, and it's a wonderful racetrack, wonderful race facility. But what you'll notice is it is basically safe. Of course, there's always danger when you're going very fast, but notice the barriers, the officials. So what I would suggest to you is that sex outside of marriage is much like street racing. It is inherently dangerous. The problems of STDs, out of wedlock pregnancies, giving your heart to many, many people, and the brokenness that follows from that, and the way that we manipulate and exploit other people, it's dangerous and deadly. However, marriage is the racetrack God has designed for sex. It's the safe place for it to happen. And much like racing, if you like to race an automobile at an amateur level, it's a wonderful hobby which can be very thrilling and great fun. In the same way, within the safe confines of marriage, sex is a wonderful gift from God. So it's designed for marriage. God is not against sex. God created sex, but He has created it for a purpose, and He knows best how it is to be used. And it's to be celebrated within marriage. Every time the Bible talks about sex, the assumption is we are talking about a heterosexual and monogamous marriage, a husband and wife in covenant. So if you'll notice in Genesis chapter 2, verses 24 and 25, it says that for this reason a husband will leave his father and mother and cleave or be joined to his wife. And then it says the two were naked, and then the husband and wife shall become one, and they are naked and felt no shame. So if you will notice, the shameless sexual intimacy of being naked and not ashamed follows the establishment of a covenant. Remember what we looked at earlier in class, that leave and join to, or elsewhere translated cleave, those are all covenant terms. So the idea is we establish a covenant and then we celebrate sexual intimacy. So what happens is our culture inverts the order. Our culture attempts to start with sexual intimacy and then hopefully somehow move into some sort of permanent relationship. So marriage is the safe and wonderful place for sex to be enjoyed, with the exception of Genesis 2:25, which says they were naked and not ashamed, referring to the husband and wife, Adam and Eve. Nakedness in the Old Testament is always connected with some form of humiliation. This is a comment I found from Victor Hamilton in his fine commentary on Genesis. So do you see the contrast there? Everywhere else in the Bible, the Old Testament, to which nakedness is addressed, it's always in a sense of shame. But here in verse 25, there is no shame. It stands out. It's a stark contrast. Why is there no shame? Because it's the covenant of marriage. It's the place where this sort of shameless intimacy is to take place. So this contrast between Genesis 2:25 and the way that nakedness is used elsewhere in the Old Testament makes the shameless intimacy between a husband and a wife vivid, even more vivid and compelling. Let's give a bit of clarification. 1 Corinthians 7:1, which says, it is good for a man not to have relations with a woman. That is not a phrase Paul is approving. Paul is citing a phrase which had taken on a life of its own in the Corinthian church. Some people in the church were saying, well, even if you're married, you shouldn't have sex together, you shouldn't touch a woman. Paul is quoting the phrase in order to refute it. So this is not a principle, but that Paul is advocating. He's saying husbands and wives should have natural and normal sexual relations with each other. Sex in marriage, one of the reasons God has given it is for the abatement of lust, and so that in a healthy marriage relationship, one can overcome the temptation of lust. Paul says clearly, immediately following 1 Corinthians 7:1, but because of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman should have her own husband. So this is about the tender love in a marriage. And he goes on. This is one of my favorite verses about romance and love in the Bible. It's 1 Corinthians 7:3. The Holman Christian Standard says this: a husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise a wife to her husband. The word duty sounds so mundane and laborious, but really I like the old King James here. Let the husband render to the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife to her husband. This is talking about the sexual act, and it's to be tender with each other. A husband rendering the act of sex with the marriage, and the wife to her husband tender. This is mutual giving in marriage. It's a mutual sharing of the gift of sex in marriage. So I want to suggest, with that in mind, 7 purposes for sex in marriage. Perhaps there are others. Some might combine a couple I have here, but I have 7 suggested purposes for sex in marriage from the Bible. First of all, of course, is procreation. We talked about that earlier in the semester when we addressed contraception. I won't address it a lot here. Closely tied to procreation, it is through the act of sex where we create a new human life that we are able to exercise dominion over the earth. So the act of sex in marriage is closely related to the exercise of human reign and rule and authority here on earth. Of course, there's shameless intimacy, a husband and wife being open and intimate with each other in a way that they are not with anyone else on the face of planet earth. It is the gift of shameless intimacy between a husband and wife. Comfort. Genesis 24:67 talks about that after Isaac's mother died, he found comfort in the arms of Rebekah. And what a tender thought that his mother has died, he's grieving, but in the arms of the sexual embrace of his wife, he was able to find comfort in his grief. It's a very tender thought. Of course, there's also relaxation and play. That's one of the reasons God has given sex. Proverbs 5:18 and 19 uses very vivid language. It says, rejoice in the wife of your youth. Always be intoxicated in her love. That word intoxicated is right on. It's the form of the verb shagah, which means to stagger, which also carries the idea of intoxication. So the idea is that a husband and wife rejoice with each other, and there is this playful sense of romantic joy with one another as a godly purpose for sex in marriage. And that is also closely tied to the fact that sex is a way to celebrate the love for one another in marriage. We see this both in Proverbs 5 as well as in the Song of Songs. It's a way to celebrate that we love each other, and a couple wants to express their love for one another that God has given them in marriage through having sex. And as Paul talked about in 1 Corinthians 7:1-3, a healthy sex life in marriage is a form of protection against sexual immorality. It's the appropriate place for sex to occur. I've already talked about how our culture inverts God's order. I'll move on from that. So, with the purposes for sex in marriage just addressed, and we'll set those aside, a bit of shift of direction here. I want to talk about husbands, wives in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 21 through chapter 6, verse 1. And what does this passage teach us? Of course, you are aware the passage is a matter of some debate among people in our culture today, but let's talk about a few things here. First of all, you can read in my notes the verb for submit is supplied from verse 21. So with that in mind, I believe verse 21 does have some application for husbands and wives. Some of my dear Baptist brothers, most notably Adrian Rogers, whom I love dearly, he passed away several years ago, he disagreed. But you can see why I believe that in the class notes, which I'll have posted. But I would also stress to you, in our culture, we get so animated over the debates, especially about verses 22 through 24 and the wife submitting to the husband. that we miss the beauty of this passage and how unique it was in antiquity, and that the husband and the wife and the children and even the servants in the household, they are all dignified as responsible moral agents. And when read in context of 2,000 years ago, the first century Roman Empire, this text stands out beautifully, but in our culture, people get worked up about it. They don't understand it in context. It is beautiful, and it stands out. It is unique in antiquity. Let's say a word about submit, and the word submit there for wives. It does mean to arrange under. It is a sort of military term. It implies submission of someone in an ordered array to another person who is above the first in some way. And in fact, elsewhere outside the Bible, used in reference of submission to soldiers in an army to someone of superior rank. And so let me say this. This is not what the Bible means by submission. I show a couple of people in their self-defense class here, and the instructor is showing a particular submission hold. I suppose that's part of the challenge of getting words into the receptor language, which for us is English. This is not what the word submit here means. This, in our culture, however, when our culture hears the word submit, they think of something like this: force, compelling, almost pain and violence. And that is not what the word means in Ephesians 5:22 through 24. It's not what it means at all. It really means lining up under and just an orderly array. So let's talk about what it doesn't mean. So let me give some clarification. First of all, this does not mean all women to all men. It is specifically relating to the relationship of a wife to her husband. It's not referring to a wife in some employee-employer relationship. So the text is narrow in focus and has heterosexual and monogamous marriage in mind. Secondly, it's voluntary. It is intelligent and voluntary. This is an intelligent choice that a woman makes. So any man who tries to read this passage and suggest, well, my wife is required to submit, has missed the whole point of the passage. This is written to wives. It's an intelligent, voluntary choice on their part and not something that's coerced by a violent man. So it cannot be coerced. I stress that, especially to the men listening. This is not something you coerce out of your wife. No. It does not mean submission to physical abuse. We'll be talking about that elsewhere in the semester, but let's be clear right here. Physical violence is never acceptable in a Christian marriage. It does not mean the wife has no voice. In fact, men, you need to listen to your wives. I cannot stress that enough. God has given us a helpmate. We need to listen. Proverbs 31:26 says this about the virtuous wife: she opens her mouth with wisdom, and on her tongue is the law of kindness. You need to listen to your wife. Also, it's clarified. Ephesians 5:22 says this submission is as unto the Lord. So this never includes submission to sinful behavior. If it's as unto the Lord would never ask us to do something sinful or cruel or harmful to ourselves. So it's as unto the Lord. That's an important clarification. Well, what does it mean? It is a tangible expression of submission to Christ, and when practiced properly, is a lovely expression of God's design for marriage. Wife is going to let her husband lead, encourage him to do so. Perhaps the idea is best captured in Ephesians 5:33 when Paul says, let the wife see that she respects her husband. That may be the best idea there. So let's say a few words to husbands. Actually, Paul spends more time talking to husbands than wives, but because of the word submit and our culture's misunderstanding, we tend to spend more time there. But I would just point out the text spends more time talking to husbands. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. And his excellent commentary on Ephesians, Honer's commentary, he points out the verb love in verse 25 is a present imperative, enforcing the idea that the husband's love for the wife is an ongoing process. It's something we do every day, day in and day out. O.S. Hawkins said this, and I like it a lot. He said, some marriages are in trouble because the husband tries to be the Lord instead of the lover. That's right. Men, you are not God. You are to love your wife as Christ, but you are not Christ. So just keep that in mind. That's a good quote from O.S. Hawkins. The preponderance of responsibility falls on the husband to set the pace for outserving your wife, outserving the wife. And remember, husbands, your wife ain't your mama. You are marrying a godly woman that God has given you. This woman is not your mama to pick up after you and clean up after you. A Christian marriage should be the picture of the relationship between Christ and the church, and the husband cares for his bride as Christ tenderly cares for the church. Christ is faithful to the church. A husband should be faithful to his wife. Christ never harms the church. The husband shouldn't harm his wife. So in this way, a heterosexual and monogamous marriage paints a picture of Christ's relationship with his church. Now, a homosexual marriage is going to paint a different kind of picture. I'm not sure what picture that is. Maybe idolatrous. But it's a different picture. It's not the same picture. So here's some questions, husbands. Are you committed to making your wife successful? Look at this, verse 28. The love of the husband for his wife should be sensitive. You need a marital radar system where you're picking up her needs. No one ever hated his own flesh, but he nourishes, he cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church. Men, outside of Jesus, does your wife know that no one matters more to you than her? So making it work every day, just a bit of advice from Lisa and I. So, nevertheless, each individual among you is also to love his wife even as himself, and the wife must see to it that she respects her husband. I think these two ideas, love and respect, really sum up what Paul is getting at in these verses. Love and respect. There's a good book by Emerson Eggerichs, I can't pronounce his last name, Eggerich, that is titled Love and Respect. He gets it from this verse. I think that's the right idea. Ladies, men want to know that you respect them. Men, your wife wants to know that you love her. If we both focus on that, we'll find it very helpful. And I want to point out something to you. For Lisa and I, listen, these verses are all important. Sometimes men, because of our nature and the way we're wound up, we like structure and order, and that's what we're looking for, so we hone in on the structure and order. That's important. I might suggest to you on a day-to-day basis, at least in my own marriage, the verse that's been most important for my wife, Lisa, and myself has been Ephesians 4:32. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving each other just as God in Christ also forgave you. So we have to forgive each other day in and day out. That's how we make it work, that we forgive each other and we're tender and we're kind to each other. If we practice that on a day-to-day basis, most marriages are going to be fine and be able to endure everything. So there's so much more I want to say, but here's a summary statement. Marriage is God's idea. It's not merely a social invention. It is a covenant and is neither a contract nor a sacrament. It is designed for one man and one woman in a lifelong covenant commitment. And it does entail specific roles for both the husband and the wife. You can see the Danvers Statement, which our school adheres to, and as I do as well. And then marriage is a picture of Christ's love for the church. I hope this has been helpful to you as we all think about what it means to have a Christian marriage.